In our final vocabulary lecture, we're going to talk about a topic which is a little bit controversial, particularly among IELTS teachers, and that is about using idioms and really trying to be a natural in your vocabulary. So, let's look at the band descriptors for why we need to talk about idioms. So a few of my students have told me that previous teachers had told them not to use idioms. And there is a good reason that they do this, which we will look at in a moment. But the most important thing when uncertainty arises, like in this case, is to look at the band descriptors, as that is the marking criteria of the examiners. And when we look at the band descriptors, we learn that in order to score a band 7 for lexical resource, a candidate must use some less common and idiomatic vocabulary and show some awareness of style and collocation. So as we can see, using idioms is an essential part of achieving a band 7 or above score. So why do some teachers suggest that we should not use idioms? Well, there are two reasons for this. First of all, they pose a huge danger of inaccuracy. A lot of people use them inaccurately. And second of all, there's this danger of shoehorning, trying to deliberately use idioms just for the sake of using idioms, so using them in inappropriate places. But there is a solution to each of these problems. The solution to inaccuracy is to avoid the use of longer idioms. And the solution to shoehorning is don't try to anticipate locations or opportunities where you can use idioms. Try to use them naturally. Don't try to anticipate the opportunities. So with idioms, basically keep everything as simple and natural as you can. Don't try to force anything. First of all, let's think about that first solution about not using long idioms. What happens then when we try to use longer idioms? Well, let's have a look at an example. Here's an idiom. Don't count your chickens before the eggs have hatched. So this idiom is used to express the idea that you shouldn't make plans for something that hasn't happened quite yet. For instance, don't buy a house in a new location when you haven't yet secured the job that you applied for in that location, for example. So it's quite useful. But the problem is the longer the idiom, the more chance there is of an inaccuracy appearing. For instance, you might make the mistake of saying something like, don't count your eggs before the chickens have hatched. Or, don't count your chickens before hatching your eggs? Chickens, eggs, and then suddenly everything disappears. And you lose your momentum in the exam, and everything can go a little bit pear-shaped. And you look a little bit like this in the exam, perhaps. So, the other issue is don't try to anticipate opportunities. And what we mean here is that you shouldn't learn idioms with the express purpose of using a particular idiom in the exam. You shouldn't try to anticipate opportunities, but they should instead appear naturally. What happens if we try to anticipate too much? Well, say I learnt the idiom piece of cake, which means a job or activity that is easy to do. Now, if I learn this idiom with the express purpose of using it in the exam, then I'm going to try to shoehorn it into my answers. This is what can happen. For example, how does technology help you in your daily life? Oh, technology makes my life a piece of cake. Or with technology, everything I do is a piece of cake. Or daily life is a piece of cake with technology. Now, all of these sound horribly unnatural. They make sense, but they're completely unnatural. So don't anticipate these opportunities, just let them arise naturally. You also need to particularly watch your pronunciation here. Don't overemphasize your idioms. This is what a lot of students do. They'll say something like my life, a piece of cake, or a piece of cake. Don't shout it at the examiner. Don't try to impress them with this vocabulary. It should appear naturally, organically. Okay, so using idioms in the exam, how should we use them? Sparingly and judiciously. And judiciously just means with good judgment. You really only need to use 2 or 3 idioms over the course of the whole speaking exam. Then you fulfill your requirements to use idiomatic vocabulary. Anything more than that can sound a bit forced. Of course, if they come up naturally, then fine, but if you deliberately try to include any more than 3, it can sound a bit forced. As for when to use idioms, listen to other native or near native speakers. As we keep saying over and over again in this course, listening practice, at least 20 minutes every day, and just try to notice the idioms that appear and when they appear. Watch movies, watch TV shows, listen to the radio, listen to podcasts, listen to audiobooks. Make sure you do all of these things with a notepad ready and mark down every idiom that you hear. Notice the pronunciation that is used and try repeating the sentence yourself as well. Let's talk about some of my favourite idioms then, some useful idioms that you can use in the exam. There's not much point in sharing examples exactly because you shouldn't force any idioms in, and examples may encourage you to do this. But here are a few idioms which I feel can be used quite easily, quite naturally, and which express quite common feelings, particularly in part 3 of the exam. Now, please note that you need to see, hear a number of examples of these idioms in context, rather than just the examples I show you. So again, it comes back to that listening practice. Go out, try to find your own favourite idioms, and remember, try to only use short ones on the day. So, I'm going to show you a few of my favourites now, and I want you to just think for yourself about what they might mean, and then we'll have a look at what they mean together. The best of both worlds. A blessing in disguise. A far cry from. Open one's eyes to. The last straw. Miss the boat. On the fence. Okay, these are all quite useful idioms that can be used in part 3 of the exam. So if we think about the best of both worlds to begin with, this means the advantages of both situations. So for example, do you think that reading novels is more interesting than reading factual books? Personally, I love reading both fiction and non-fiction. When reading novels, I get to immerse myself in another world, and it's nice to have that sort of escapism. But with non-fiction, I feel like I'm broadening my horizons, and the experience is quite nourishing. Neither is more interesting. Reading fiction and non-fiction gives me the best of both worlds. Now, something to notice is that in each of these answers, I have included the idiom in question, the best of both worlds in this case, but I may have also included another idiom, which could be quite useful in your exam. Can you find the idiom here? Yes, it's broadening my horizons, which essentially means to sort of expand your mind, grow your tolerance, and get new experiences. Okay, a blessing in disguise. This means an apparent problem that has good results. We can find this in the answer to the question, do you agree there is a right age for children to stop living with their parents? And remember, try to listen out for another idiom here as well. Yes, I'd say so. I don't think children should rely on their parents to house them forever, and they need to learn to stand on their own 2 feet. If they don't, they could really struggle to form their own independence. I can remember when I left home. It was difficult at first, but that difficult time was a blessing in disguise as I became stronger as a result. So it initially seemed negative, but it was actually positive, a blessing in disguise. And the extra idiom here, to stand on their own 2 feet. Basically to be independent and to not need to rely on anybody else. A far cry from, which means very different to. We have the question here, which source of news do you think is best? TV, newspaper, internet, or something else? And the answer, well, I'd say the best source of news is probably TV news, but it's not my preferred choice. I get most of my news updates from the internet, but that's only because it's the most convenient. I think TV news is better because it is much more accurate. Anyone can write an article on the internet, which is a far cry from the strict media regulations of TV. So a far cry from just means it's very different to, very, very different to. You're emphasizing that. There's no extra idiom here, so let's move on to the next one. Open one's eyes to. which means to cause someone to realize something. Example question, why do you think some people are not concerned by environmental issues? I think this happens for a couple of reasons. Firstly, many people might feel they are too small to make a difference. They might think their carbon footprint is not going to make a dent in global warming overall. Secondly, the environment is too large a subject to comprehend. Only local change will open some people's eyes to the dangers of climate change. So only if things change locally will people realize something, will people realize the dangers of climate change. And there's another idiom in here as well, if you can find it. Carbon footprint. And a carbon footprint is basically how much somebody contributes to climate change through global warming and so forth. Basically, you have a large carbon footprint if, let's say, you drive down to the local shops instead of walk. You have a small carbon footprint if you recycle everything and you walk everywhere. So large carbon footprint, contribute a lot to climate change. Small carbon footprint, you don't contribute a lot. The last straw. This means the final problem that ends one's patience. You may have heard of the longer expression, the straw that broke the camel's back. And this is basically that, but in a shorter form. We can also say the final straw. A question here, what reasons might people have for not wanting to give their opinions in surveys? Well, speaking from experience, I can think of one important reason. Sometimes telephone companies call you up and ask you to take part in a survey, and that's okay, but once is enough. I got called 4 times by the same company last week, and the 5th was the final straw. I blacklisted their number after that. Also, some people are just quite private about their views. Okay, so the final straw. It was the final call, and then I completely lost my patience. No extra idiom here, so let's go forward. Miss the boat. Too slow to make use of an opportunity. Example, what are the advantages and disadvantages of intensive training for sports people? On the one hand, intensive training can help sports people to achieve their sporting dreams at huge events. If Usain Bolt hadn't trained intensively, week in, week out, he might have missed the boat on the Olympics. On the other hand, intensive training forces athletes to miss out on time with family and friends, and the psychological pressure can be a burden. Okay, so missed the boat, he would have missed the opportunity to go to the Olympics. And you could argue here that week in, week out is a nice idiom to use as well, to mean something you do every week. Finally, on the fence. On the fence means that you're unable to decide on something, which is very useful when the examiner asks you a question and you have to decide between one or another thing and you can't quite decide. So example, some people think national celebrations are a waste of money. Do you agree? And why? I'm on the fence on this one. On the one hand, I feel like these celebrations are important in that they help to develop a sense of unity and togetherness among citizens. But on the other hand, this money might be much better spent on helping the poor and improving the quality of our education. I guess we should still have these events, but not spend so much on them. Okay, so no extra idiom here, but you can see how on the fence is meant to be used when you are sort of for and against a particular argument. Some final points here before we close off this lecture. Study idioms by the topic. Don't just look at a long list, kind of like the one I've given you here really, but study idioms by the topic. So if you're focusing on the topic of education, look for idioms related to education. Don't use idioms which are very long. So as we talked earlier about ones like don't count your chickens before the eggs have hatched, try to avoid idioms like that. Don't over-anticipate. Allow idioms to turn up naturally in your responses. You can practice by all means, but try not to anticipate on the day. Check idioms in a number of settings. This is the problem with idioms. They're very nuanced in a way. They're very difficult to use naturally, so the best way to learn how is to listen to other people. Practice with a native, whether that's finding a teacher on the IELTSteacher.com or whether that's finding a study partner or just a native friend. Try to make sure you're using them accurately by practicing with a native. And don't use too many idioms in the exam. You only really need to use 2, 3, 4 idioms. If you use many more than that, you may come across sounding a little bit forced. Collocations we have not talked about. They are another very important feature of your vocabulary. But to learn about collocations, you can actually watch the video I created on this topic in my Mastering IELTS Writing Task 2 course. If you go to that page on Udemy, you'll see that it's one of the free preview videos, and everything that's in that video will still be relevant to the speaking exam as well. So instead of repeating all of that information here, best thing to do is go over to that page and check out that video there. I hope you enjoy it.